Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Paul Cooper, whose new book, The Fall of Civilisations, Stories of Greatness and Decline, and the product of an epically successful podcast. Has I've been reading it recently and hugely enjoying the processes of the rise and fall of ancient and medieval civilizations. So firstly, welcome, Paul. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
And okay, so to begin with, it's a kind of a huge sweep of time in the book, and it features, I think it's probably about a dozen civilizations or so. What inspired the book? Tell us a bit about its origins.
So the book is the imprint version of the podcast that I've been hosting and producing for the last 5 years or so, which is called Fall of Civilisations. And each episode of the podcast looks at a different society from history that collapsed and tries to find out the story behind each collapse, what went wrong, what we can learn from it, and perhaps most importantly, what it felt like to be a person alive at the time who lived through these times of great upheaval and disruption. The podcast itself zigzags around history. I haven't done each episode in a chronological order, but as I began putting the material together for the book, I began to realize that what we had in the podcast material was kind of an account of human history through the lens of societal collapse. Yeah. You can actually leapfrog from one collapse to the next, and in that way tell the story of all of humanity.
There's some interesting things, I think, when you're talking about, how people would have experienced that. I forget whether it's F. Scott Fitzgerald or Ernest Hemingway when he said, bankruptcies happen very slowly, then all at once. And probably in the decline of civilizations, most people experience the very slowly bit of things sort of not being great as they once were, and then not being as great as that, and a gradual trajectory over a long period of time until there's a kind of a crunch moment. Is that sort of something that's kind of observable throughout some of the case studies you've seen?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, every and in this book as well is that everyone is its own story, and although they have some particularities in common, you can never really generalize about them. That being said, as you say, you get certain collapses that happen like a thunderclap overnight. The fall of the Assyrian Empire, for instance, or the collapse of the classic Maya really occur in historical terms almost overnight. The Assyrian Golden Age is, in the middle of the 7th century. They're building their largest palaces. They're carving these immaculate works of art, like the lion hunt reliefs of Ashurbanipal. But within decades, the entire civilization comes apart. Their enemies flood around them. Every one of their capitals is sacked, and they'll never be reoccupied. Yeah. Similar with the classic Maya, the great city-states like Tikal, in the year 800 are building their most majestic monuments, their towering temples painted this brilliant red color. But within 100 years or so, no more monuments will be built. There will no longer be a king in cities like Tikal. The entire royal system has come apart. But there are declines, as you said, that happen much more slowly. You get a kind of gradual building up of stress factors on the weak points of the society that slowly accumulate until you end up with a kind of cascading collapse through the system.
And I think that there are probably very few civilizations out there that are kind of imagine their own demise, really. The idea that there is a rise and a fall. I mean, here in this kind of global 21st century society civilization of sorts that we kind of exist in. That's a hugely contested point there. But most people, most of the time, imagine the kind of like the permanence of now. And I would guess that we're not unique in that. We just have just the people in the past have different ways of thinking about that.
Mm.
Um, a lot of I think there's a tendency for people to look for a kind of a unifying theory of decline and then map that onto the present. And but what you're saying is, well, there kind of isn't one really. Is that true?
Yeah, there have been countless efforts to systematize decline. And, these often end up in slightly reductive systems. People will come up with the 5 signs that a society is collapsing, or they'll categorize one factor like complexity as the problem in a society, and then measure the collapse by the loss of complexity. These systems, I think, often lead down the path of cherry picking evidence in order to then match your system.
Yeah.
I think people lose track of the fact that all of these stories are just so different. Nothing in history ever really happens the same way again. Each one of these events is immensely chaotic, but that's not to say there aren't certain themes that do reoccur. I think over the course of the series, we've seen countless times that some level of environmental change is a factor in the collapse of one civilization, for instance. Human societies are a little like biological organisms in that they adapt and evolve to their environments and become quite specialized in surviving in a particular set of circumstances and in a particular habitat, if you like. And when that habitat changes too rapidly, the society can be put under pressures that it simply is not able to adapt to at a quick enough rate. So in that way, you do see common themes emerge from some of these collapses, while in each one they play out in a slightly different way.
And we've got to avoid that temptation of this kind of the teleology of looking at the end point and imagining a kind of inevitability. I mean, in many years of sort of teaching about, say, for example, the Russian Revolution, there was a point I always made to my students: there's nothing inevitable about really the fall of the Tsar or the rise of the Bolsheviks or anything of the sort. Really, these are, improbable events in a way. And yet when they happen, then they're no longer improbable. And I think decline and collapse really is one of those things where we have to be wary.
Absolutely, and I think it's so important when you're telling stories about history, when you're narrativizing history, to give your reader a sense of exactly what you described, that nothing here was set in stone, nothing here was inevitable. And one of the most amazing stories we've looked at is the collapse of the Aztec Empire, the Mexica Empire in the Valley of Mexico. And it's one of the most unlikely stories you can imagine. The Spaniards, arriving on what was supposed to be a temporary, almost rescue mission in the coast of Mexico, landing in Veracruz, marching inland for 400 kilometers to this island city in the center of the vast Lake Texcoco, and then toppling an empire that ruled over millions of people. It's one of the most bizarre stories in history, but it all really happened. There were so many points at which it could have gone differently, but it didn't. I think those are some of the most amazing stories to tell in history, because nothing about this really had to happen.
And I think there was something I was really fascinated by when reading about Byzantium, and about the division of obviously the Western and the Eastern Roman empires. And it speaks to our sort of teleological view of the past, where it suddenly occurred to me that you were writing about how people at the time didn't really see it like that. They didn't see that anything particularly had changed, that the empire had divided, or you're an Easterner or I'm a Westerner now. And their sense of self really is and the sense of identity is really sort of just kind of continues. And it makes me, it put me in mind of a really good book I once read on the kind of the social context to the American Civil War, about how Southerners and Northerners for a long time view themselves as roughly the same people, and then sort of by about the 1840s, 1850s, socially and culturally, they are suddenly just other from one another.
Mm.
And they view it's and there's purely because they view and see the world in increasingly divergent ways. Um, and it shows you how polities can just sort of fracture like that.
Mm.
And it sort of happens in sort of tiny increments until
Mm.
something occurs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the funnier aspects of Byzantine history is the way that they and the Holy Roman Empire, which both the Eastern Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire were making a claim to be successor states to the Roman Empire, and the Byzantines would often denigrate the Holy Roman Emperor by calling him the King of Germany, and meanwhile the Germans would refer to the Byzantine Emperor as King of the Greeks.
Yeah.
This attempt to downgrade each other's status and therefore reinforce their own claim to being the true successor of Rome. Yeah, it's really funny to see how these imagined communities are in the process of being made in real time.
Yeah, and there are things. Talking about the end of, say, the Roman Empire, but key aspects of Rome kind of lived on and arguably still do. And civilizations in some ways have an afterlife, don't they?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you lived in Gaul or Spain in the 5th century, you likely wouldn't have seen a huge amount of difference in your life from the Roman period. You would have seen a bit more violence and upheaval. Perhaps there was a marauding band of Vandals would pass through the countryside from time to time, but essentially you're still paying your taxes to the same landlord, probably. In places like Egypt and obviously Constantinople, what collapse, things went on absolutely as normal. I think one of the most interesting stories we've looked at is the case of Roman Britain, which, partly due to its unique status in the empire, its position as an island that was somewhat more separated from the central landmass, there was a really precipitous societal decline. Almost overnight, whole classes of objects stopped being produced. Things like nails, which meant that coffins were no longer nailed shut, that shoes stopped having hobnails in them. Things like knives were no longer being produced, and also cut stone. Metals were no longer being mined on an industrial scale, and the kind of pots that British people used to cook in also stopped being produced, which means that British people stopped eating stew almost overnight. The loss of Roman market gardens meant British people no longer ate parsley and coriander. The entire lifeway of the British peasant class changed quite rapidly in the years after 410 AD.
Yeah.
So you actually see the ways in which the collapse actually plays out on the material level and on people's ways of life as well.
Because I suppose if you were plugged into the Roman Empire, then you were part of a system that runs from Hadrian's Wall to Palmyra, and so you're plugged into an ancient sort of smaller version of kind of globalization in a way. You're these networks of trade, and not wanting to kind of echo contemporary circumstances. When you wrench yourselves out of kind of global systems, or you're wrenched out of global systems, then it has a kind of a direct effect on living standards.
Yeah, absolutely. It was in 2019, living with some of the consequences of, again, pulling the plug on our connection to the mainland in the form of Brexit. But it goes to show just how dramatic an effect a collapse can have.
Yeah.
Some of these collapses are stories of transformation as one society gives way to a successor society or to a slightly different form of government that some of these are extremely precipitous drops in population. The British population is speculated to have halved in a matter of decades, and that these are really severe consequences on people's lives.
Yeah. Do you find that, in particularly in terms of empires, that empires, I mean, we know in the modern era empires have done this, but in ancient and medieval times, did empires create sort of other states in their image, places that they colonize? And
yeah, it's always a complicated story, that kind of spread of empire and colonization. You can imagine it like the tide coming in and filling a rock pool with new forms of life, new minerals and so on. These kind of successive waves of cultural influence that you can see quite clearly in somewhere like Britain because of its position as this isolated pocket off the mainland. You see almost successive waves of different cultures pass over the island, and each one leaving its mark, but also indigenizing as well and adapting to the ways of life it found here.
Yeah,
I think that's what gives us such unique cultural character and makes our language so expressive because it has so many influences upon it.
yeah. The Normans found the kind of process of Anglicization. There's often quite a lot of writing about it of Normans returning home to Normandy and people saying, well, you've changed really, and you've gone native, and recognizing that actually when you conquer somewhere, you are partly assimilated into the people that you conquer. If you don't, of course, kill them all, which is one way of kind of avoiding that. So, kind of, I guess, looking at where we are at in the 21st century, there are a number of kind of existential threats, really, to the continuance of the kind of the globalized civilization that we have, which you could say doesn't include everybody. There are some people some nations that aren't really part of that. And at present, you have obviously in certain countries facing their own kind of civilizational kind of existential moments as well. Do you see lots of parallels to the present moment from the writing and the research that you've done?
Yeah, it's impossible not to really. I found that the show began to pick up a lot of listeners during the COVID pandemic.
Right.
Partly because I think a lot of people were stuck indoors and wanted something to listen to, but also I began to get a lot of messages about how people had found it comforting while going through this period of great upheaval and disruption in our society to hear about times that people in the past had been through similar things and come through the other side. I think we feel today like we live in a time of unique crisis and upheaval. There's a new danger around the corner on every rolling news cycle. But really, this is a very ancient feeling that people have always felt, that they're on the precipice of something, some terrible happening, perhaps the end of the world, the second coming of Christ, the day of judgment. But people have also lived through transformations to their entire life way that have been utterly destructive. And we find again and again that there's this hopeful sense that when a society has been destroyed, much like in a forest fire, you get these green shoots of rejuvenation coming through afterwards, that fertile ash almost gives birth to the next stage of society. And I think in the 21st century, there are a lot of threats that our societies face, but over and above, the main one will be climate change and the transformations that are occurring to our planet. They're going to be severe. They're going to put immense pressure on our agricultural systems, on our society's infrastructure, our abilities to adapt to natural disasters, etc. it remains to be seen whether we're able to rise to those challenges. But what we've learned from the past is that it is possible.
Yeah, yeah. And there are, I was reading recently an excellent book by Mustafa Suleiman, who is
Mm.
it's essentially the guy, one of the kind of visionaries of artificial intelligence, who's wrote this kind of after pioneering this technology, wrote a kind of 250-page warning letter
Mm.
about how this transformational technology, which will do all sorts of great things, needs to be very, very tightly constrained and controlled.
Mm.
Are there examples that you've seen of societies that are harmed by the things that they create, harmed by their own innovations?
Yeah, I think one of the most common themes in all of these stories of collapse is the way that the initial productive forces that allowed a society to flourish often eventually grow to become liabilities, but that the society is unable or unwilling to change course, that these liabilities become bigger and bigger and eventually lead to a collapse. One example is, for instance, the immense irrigation technologies of societies like the Sumerians.
Mhm.
They were able to create vast arable farmlands in an area that was very water poor in the valley of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. Uh, Water evaporated in the fields. It was leaving behind saline deposits that was making the earth steadily more salty, and
Yeah,
it was becoming more and more difficult for crops to grow. And over the centuries, the Sumerians had to change from growing 90% wheat, which is a more fragile, sensitive crop, to switching to barley, essentially,
right.
which is a much more hardy and salt resistant crop. And in this, we see that they were having to adapt to this liability that was building up in their society, uh, this technique of irrigating their fields that was slowly destroying the quality of their soil. But as time went on, they found that they were simply unable to change course, and this became one of the contributory factors to their collapse.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I guess, I mean, one thing that the world is all kind of looking at with a degree of apprehension or delight, depending on where you stand on the subject, is the forthcoming American election. So
Mm.
there was a movie, I think, early this year about a kind of an imagined American Civil War. And this kind of discourse around America, which has always kind of been there, but in kind of the realm of speculative fiction, has slowly kind of creeps forward to a more kind of I hope that doesn't happen, but it's not entirely unlikely. When
Mm.
you look at certain imperiums that have become, fissile, started to kind of drift
Mm.
apart, do you get a sense that these things kind of the changes in America kind of follow possible things that you've seen in the past? I mean, in terms of kind of
Mm.
people not getting on, shall we say?
What will happen in the US? Probably, if you're looking at the collapse of a modern society, you need to look at something more like the fall of the Soviet Union or
Mhm.
the coming apart of Yugoslavia.
Yeah,
Um, these lessons do teach us that things can happen very quickly.
yeah,
The strong social fabric that people take for granted can actually come unpicked relatively rapidly.
yeah,
And I think that kind of I think documentary footage from Yugoslavia was used as quite a strong reference for Alex Garland's Civil War film.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I think there are factors in the US that mirror certain periods in history. I think
yeah,
that one factor I find really interesting about their politics is that it's slowly become a gerontocracy, which
yes,
is the rule of the aged, the rule of people who are older than the average adult in the country.
Yeah.
To have two presidential candidates who were born in 1942 and 1946 is quite remarkable. Donald
I
Trump, the
think,
younger man, is actually a month older than George W. Bush, who became president 24 years ago. It's a society where they're really struggling to pass political power onto the next generation. And so power is becoming more and more solidified in these knots, these nodes
yeah.
of these influential staffs that surround these political figures with immense name recognition simply by virtue of their having been around for 60 years.
Well, this is the gerontocracy at the end of the Soviet Union of
Mm.
Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko. We sort of point
Mm.
to that with a kind of a wry snigger at the time. All younger than Biden and Trump.
Yeah,
Um,
significantly
young whippersnappers in
younger.
comparison.
Yeah, they were dying at like 69, 74. Yeah, I mean, Ronald Reagan once joked that Soviet premiers kept dying on him, and they did. They died in office. But it's something you're starting to see now in the US with people like Dianne Feinstein, who
Mhm.
is being wheeled into the Senate, well past her capacity to really be working
Yeah,
by these staffs who actually can't afford to let these people retire. Too much power becomes invested in them. Too many people's careers are now dependent on them,
yeah,
and it's not a sign of a healthy democracy. One parallel I sometimes think about is in the Han Dynasty of China in the second century AD. You actually began to see that the emperor, once a all-powerful figure, the divine monarch, had become just really a pawn in the chess game of the imperial palace.
mhm,
You had influential groups of eunuchs, eunuch advisors, who amassed great personal power and wealth. You also had the women of the palace, the empress dowagers, the widow, still milling around, gathering power around themselves. And in these power games, the emperors were usually chosen not for their ability or their leadership or charisma, but for how easy they were to control.
yeah,
So these were often either uh, very indulgent, wastrel sons who just wanted to lie around all day with their dancing girls, or more frequently, they were really young children.
mm,
One Emperor Shang was actually a newborn baby in his first year when he was crowned. And it must have been an amazing sight to see this coronation with all its pomp and circumstance, the official seal of the emperor being handed to this baby boy, and a sword known as the sword that slays the snake, which was passed from emperor to emperor from the earliest days of the Han Dynasty,
mm,
all surrounding this infant who must have been, red-faced and crying and his fists balled as everyone bowed around him. And this emperor only lasted a few months before he himself was poisoned and another child emperor was put in his place. But it's a real sign of political stagnation,
yeah,
the struggle to pass power on to the next generation, to
yeah,
keep the flow of power moving through a society. I think the US is really struggling with that at the moment.
yeah. And that example of the Han emperor baby
Mm.
is where the stagnation becomes so apparent that you have these absurdities.
Mm.
And we, not just in America, you look around the world and we're in an age where absurdities abound, which maybe tells you
Mm.
something.
Mm.
So I will draw to a close in just a moment. But before we do, let's give the book a good plug. So it is The Fall of Civilisations, Stories of Greatness and Decline. Available in all good bookshops. And you can pick yourself up a copy. I'll place a link to it in the podcast episode notes. And it goes without saying, as we always do on this podcast, if you can support your local independent bookshop, please do. They really need you, and they are kind of a key aspect of our modern social landscape and civilization, indeed, that we don't want
Mm.
to lose.
Mm. Yeah, I heard about a wonderful website recently called bookshops.org,
Okay.
which basically connects you to your local independent bookshop, allows you to order on a kind of Amazon-like platform, but your business goes to the local bookshop. So I'd encourage everyone to try and get the book through that if you can.
Well, I'll use that today and from here on in as a way of promoting writers and good local bookshops. So, Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you today, and the very best of luck with the book, and perhaps we can talk about civilizations again in the future.
No, I'd love that. Thanks for having me on, Nick.
Take good care. All the best.